Well, thank you. It is a real honor to be asked back twice to the same location. Sometimes you give a speech and they're like, okay, enough. We can't have that lady back again. Too much bad news. But it's definitely an honor to be back with you guys. And I'm going to cover 30 by 30 again, a little bit like we did last year, just to make sure everybody in the room is caught up with what this program is. But then mostly what I want to focus on tonight is how they have been implementing it since I was here last. They've made some real progress, and it's kind of sickening to me to be the one watching all of this develop. But on the other hand, we're making some great progress on pushing this back. And there's some great things happening in DC that we're working on, some of which I can share, some of which I probably shouldn't. But I know what I'm going to tell you today isn't necessarily going to be very uplifting, but I do hope that by the time we get through the end, you will have confidence that we're really putting a dent in this agenda. So I think last year I told you a little bit about my background, and I might share a little bit more. I'm going to see if I can run the technology. It's going to be different this year. I'm not holding two microphones, so this is going to be different. But I think last year I told you I grew up on a ranch in Nevada. Well, this year I brought a picture. This is a picture that hangs on my wall that I love because it's me when I was 10 years old on the top of Table Mountain, 12,000 foot elevation with my dad. And if the horse I'm riding tells you anything about her personality, I was riding a mare, my mom's mare. She fit me perfectly because I was probably a little bit on the wild side myself and not so manageable. But this is Table Mountain, about 12,000 foot elevation. And it's very deceiving because up at the top, it's like this flat plateau, which is where it gets its name, but it's completely rugged. Only 3 single file trails to get up there, and you pretty much have to know the trails to get up there. But this is the country that I was raised in. And this is the ranch the government took from us. And I think last year when I shared this story, I probably gave you a few of those details. But I think what is that experience, I think when you can go through things like that as a child and see your whole family's livelihood taken away from you in an unjust way, when that happens, you have really 2 choices. You can be bitter, or you can decide that you're going to do everything in your power not to let that happen to others and to beat them in another way. And I'd like to say I'm in that camp. But it's also because of that is the reason why 30 by 30 is so scary to me. Because this is an agenda of people who are trying to take from Americans, just like you said, what we have because what we have is good. You know, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter when he was in France, and he wrote it back home to a James Madison, a Reverend James Madison, different than the one that we're familiar with. And he talked about that day, what he did that day, and he was walking through the countryside, and he met up with just a French lady, common lady in France, one of the populace. So she was pretty much a serf, owned no property, was a day worker. She was headed to the next town to try to find a little bit of work so she could feed her children. And she was typical of most of the French people. But as they were walking, Jefferson noted that they were walking through these lush kingslands, huge forests and meadows, and full of resources and firewood that could have been picked up, but it would have been illegal for her to do so. And he saw the injustice of how when the government, in this case, the kings and the elites in France, own all the land, the people are impoverished. And she had no way to get out of that situation. And so he tells that story to Reverend James Madison in this letter, and it's a great letter to read. And he concludes by saying, we can't let this happen in America. In America, it is the small landholder that is the most important part of the state. And so when we think about how our country was founded, I mean, we think in terms of, okay, we have this great Constitution. It protects and enumerates our Bill of Rights. You know, there's a separation of powers, which was brilliant. I mean, there's so many things about the way our nation was set up that it's first and it's brilliant. But what protects that? That's a piece of paper. That can be torn up if the wrong people get in power. What keeps that document the living document of this land? It's because the people own the land. The people have the power to control their government. We own the natural resources of the nation, not the government. And that gives us not only the ability to make our own living, as John Locke said, mix your labor with the land and produce and earn your own livelihood. Not only does it do that, but it allows us to control and restrain our government, because the government has to come to us for its money. In theory. I think we look around today and we're thinking, okay, that's not working out real well right now. But partly because right now in America, the government, federal, state, and local, own nearly 40% of our land. And they are coming for the rest. So when we're talking about 30 by 30, that's what we're talking about. You know, when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase, so it added about 540 million acres to the nation at that time. It doubled. It doubled the size of the nation. You guys, this land here was probably a part of that. All right? So you know, when it was opened up, when they made that purchase, Thomas Jefferson didn't call up the Bill Gates of the world, or China, or any other big funder or power person and say, how much of this do you want? It was disposed to the people. So you could go out and stake your 120 acres or your 640 acres, depending on which state you were in and what Homestead Act was in place at the time. And you could stake that, and you could make that your land and earn your living from that piece of land. That's what built the middle class in America. That is what allows us to be a nation of self-rule, where we, the people, really do rule our government. And that is unprecedented. No other nation has ever done that. Let me tell you one more philosophical thing, and then we'll get into the topic, but I'm on a roll. You know, when America was founded, think about this. What was our most sophisticated form of ground transportation at that time?
Horses.
Horse and buggy. And we've already put a man on the moon in 200 years. By unleashing the individual's ability to produce and have individual liberties. No other nation did that. We did. We did because of our system of government, and that we have exported to the world. So yes, we are the envy of the world. And those who want the power and the control over us have to tear that down. So sometimes when I look at the agendas we're fighting in America, because they're big, they're many, and they're coming at us fast. I think about, wow, you know, how are we going to deal with all this? But then I think about how we are the beacon of the world. If they can take down America, the rest of the world falls too. So, on to more enlightening topics. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start rolling into 30 by 30. And let me just start by, first by going forward in the slides would be good. Let me start just with the basics on 30 by 30 in case there's anybody here who wasn't here last year and is unfamiliar with the program. So we're going to walk through really kind of the basics behind the program. It'll be a little refresher to some of you, but then we're going to get into what's going on today. So 30 by 30 is an international agenda to permanently protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. Now that's 7 years away. It's an international agenda. This is not an American idea. But in America, this organization, Center for American Progress, which is a socialist, progressive left organization. You can go to their website, they'll tell you that. They are the entity that really is pushing this agenda. And they came out in 2020 with this particular report called How Much Nature Should America Keep? And this is really the document that I always kind of tee back to because it really lays out their agenda. And it explains how we need to tell the American people about this to convince them to sign up and think that this is a good idea. Because remember, they have a particular problem here in America that they don't have in other countries. We own the land. So in other countries, they could just go to the government, convince the government, and the government signs up for all these programs and starts moving into 30 by 30. In America, they have to convince us, the landowners, to do that. So this is the document that really explains and tells the environmental groups and the progressives and the policy people who are supporting this agenda how you pitch 30 by 30. Let's talk a little bit about what their perspective is. What do they advocate in this report? They say the reason we have to have this is because in the coming decades, over 1 million species will go extinct if we don't permanently protect 30% of the lands and oceans. Now, this is not based on data. This is based on models. And so anybody with any scientific integrity knows you don't use models to call for the transformation of a society, the conclusions of models to call for the transformation of society. That's not what scientists are supposed to be depending on. We're supposed to be depending on facts. That this is all based on models, taking a subjective set of assumptions and extrapolating those out for many decades to get to the conclusion that you want to get to scare the people. So that's where that figure comes from. They say we're losing a football field of habitat every 30 seconds in America to development. They say 2/3 of that development is on private lands, but only 1% of it is permanently protected. This is what really impacts you. In Texas, we had an organization there, an agriculture organization, when this first came out, sent a letter out to its members and said, hey, don't worry about 30 by 30, it's just a federal lands problem. And I'm going, what? Oh no, they really, really want the private land. That's how they control the country. And they say only 12% of the total land in the US is permanently protected in its natural state. So the government owns, as I said earlier, nearly 40%. The federal government owns 27% of the land, but only 12%, including private land and federal land, they consider permanently protected. So we're not talking about ownership. We're talking about the level of control of that property that they have. All right. So the first clue that we were going to be fighting this in the Biden administration was when we found this resolution that was filed in the House and the Senate that supports and advocates these 30 by 30 ideas. And it was who signed these that troubled us and knew that we were going to be fighting this. Then Vice President Kamala Harris, or Senator Kamala Harris, now Vice President, and then Representative Deb Haaland. And Deb Haaland is now the Secretary of the Department of Interior, which controls most of the federal land that is owned by the federal government, and an awful lot on private lands because she oversees the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Endangered Species Act, which impacts a lot of private property. So we had two true believers who were going to have top positions in the Biden administration. So we knew we were going to be fighting this. This was initiated January 27th by executive order, 6 days after the president was elected. And it's in a 57-page executive order, the Climate Crisis Executive Order. And at section 216, there's 2 paragraphs that talk about this idea of conserving 30% of our lands. Most people didn't really catch what this meant. We did because we were waiting for it. And it says, the goal is to conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. Take note, it says as at least. At least. That same day, the Department of Interior issued a fact sheet which explained what they would be doing to implement that executive order. And in that, you'll see some familiar language. When they get to the section on 30 by 30, they say, hey, we're losing a football field worth of habitat every 30 seconds in America. Including when we'll lose 1/3 of all U.S. wildlife, and that only 12% of the lands are permanently protected today in the manner that they seek for the 30%. So when we saw this, it's cut and paste out of that CAP report I showed you earlier. We knew exactly what we were fighting. We were fighting the most radical, extreme perspective of 30 by 30. We weren't fighting the light version. All right, so what makes up the 12%? The national parks, the wilderness areas, the conservation easements in perpetuity on private lands. This is what the environmentalists are really pushing right now across America. You guys have I'll be surprised if there isn't somebody in this room who's been approached by the Nature Conservancy or some land trust with a really sweet deal for you on signing up for a conservation easement in perpetuity. Now, a lot of people think that when they sign these, they still own that land. And I've been in many arguments with people who have signed them, and I think half of it is because they've signed them and they don't really want to admit that maybe they shouldn't have done that once they learn what they are really about. But in a nutshell, let me tell you what conservation easements are. You as a landowner are selling the development right to a land trust. And when you do that, you're selling an awful lot more because you're going to sign a contract and you're going to agree to the conservation purpose, a new conservation purpose for your land, which is the controlling purpose for your land forevermore. And the conservation easement contracts that I've written, there's a very loosely worded conservation purpose, couple paragraphs, that can be very subjectively interpreted so that they can mean whatever the environmentalists need them to mean at some point. And then there's 12 to 20 pages of restrictions on the landowners. So when you sign a conservation easement in perpetuity, you definitely have the right to do that as a private landowner. It's your right. Just understand that when you do that, it's no longer private property because you no longer have control of that land, and control is the fundamental element of private property. So one of the things that I try to tell people to understand is the only people that are prevented from developing the land at that point, are going to be you, the landowner. Was on the phone with some county commissioners dealing with the carbon pipeline and that's coming through, not this area specifically, but you guys are all aware of it and probably some are impacted with it. And one of the county commissioners asked me, he said, how can we have a piece of property over here that has a conservation easement on it and they're going to condemn that for that pipeline. How can they do that? And I said, well, because land with a conservation easement can still be condemned for a public purpose. Most landowners don't know that. Most landowners think when they put that conservation easement on their land in perpetuity, it's safe forever from development. No, it's not. It's only safe from you and your heirs from developing it. That's the only thing that it prevents. State parks, national wildlife refuges, national monuments, and other protected areas. The definition in the CAP report is according to the currently accepted international and domestic standards for an area of land or ocean to be counted as protected, it must be permanently protected in its natural condition, and extractive uses must be limited or prohibited. We're not going to be using this land. I say, wait, we, as in this room, won't be using the land. The elites, the government, the environmentalists will be doing what they want with it. This is the map that shows what lands currently are already permanently protected. The two darkest areas on that map make up the 12%. The light green is the area that the federal government typically owns, but there's still multiple uses on it, so they don't consider it permanently protected. And of course, the gray area are mainly our private lands in America. National Geographic showed this graph when they did their piece in 2019 promoting, advocating for 30 by 30 in America. They showed the small block is what 12% looks like, and the large block is what 30% looks like. And for those of you guys who are at our summit, You remember hearing Governor Ricketts, and I still love how he says this. But he said, this is the equivalent of protecting one state of Nebraska every year for the next 9 years, or 2 states of Texas. That's how much land we're talking about. It's about 700 million acres is what makes up the 30%. They already have 300 million of those acres. That's their 12%. So they're trying to get another 400 million acres in the next, now 7 years. And that statement, we're losing a football field worth of habitat every 30 seconds in America. Well, we'll run the numbers. That's 3,000 acres a day, or 1.1 million acres a year, which comes to 11 million acres in 10 years. Okay, that's the problem as they define it. Remember, it's habitat being converted to developed areas. And according to their math, they think the best scenario, that is 11 million acres in 10 years. So you have to ask the question, why are they trying to acquire 400 million acres in 9 short years? We don't have a 400 million acre problem. This is about control. Is private land a target? Absolutely. They say through the CAP report in many, many places, in many different ways, they must have the working landowner participating in this program. That's the first step, is to get you to participate in the program, in the conservation programs. And then they have plans, and they're written out, I've read them, of how they know once they get you in those conservation programs that it's very easy to take you the rest of the distance. Is 30% the end goal? Nope. Protecting 30% of the lands and waters is not the last 30%. These people are pursuing the half-Earth agenda, which means we must protect 50% of the lands and oceans by 2050 in order to save humanity. And you know what's really scary about that agenda? I mean, all of us, we would read this and just laugh. You know, this is ridiculous. This doesn't make any sense. These people really believe it. The people advocating it, and when I've heard them talk about it, the passion, and they're frightened for the future if we don't do this. And it's amazing, but they are true believers. And we have many in the Biden administration who are true believers in this agenda, and they're working towards this. So are some of the states. New Mexico's governor signed an executive order, a 30 by 30 executive order. She's all in on this concept. Not only does she advocate for the 30% set aside conservation, but she also includes a 20% climate stabilization area. State of New Mexico right now is on their 3rd set of public comments that they're taking for this program. And in the first round, they had like a Q&A that was the most ridiculous Q&A I think I've ever seen, where they were basically what they were asking the public is, how do you define conservation? When you go out into an open area, how does it make you feel? And they want the public to define what conservation means to them. And then that's what they evidently, from what we can tell, is how they're going to define conservation in New Mexico. It's absolutely nonsensical. There's nothing scientific about it. And the state of Vermont. The state of Vermont, the House and the Senate passed a bill to conserve 50% of the state by 2050. It passed both houses. Thankfully, there was a Republican governor who was just elected, and he vetoed the bill. Yeah, that deserves a clap. And you know, this shouldn't be surprising to you. Remember, this is where Senator Bernie Sanders is from, Vermont. So we already know the way that state is kind of made up. But this should be pretty uplifting to you, that state elected a governor who would veto this. That actually is a very good sign from my perspective. All right, who's running the 30 by 30 program? You guys might remember this from last year. I probably could just do a Q&A a little bit on some of this in here. Do you remember who's the chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality? Council on Environmental Quality is a cabinet seat in the White House. She's the chairman. She's also the co-chairman of the 30 by 30 task force. And her chief of staff is Matt Lee Ashley, who wrote this report. He has been there from day one. So from day one, the Biden administration has been working on this agenda. And last year, when Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden appointed John Podesta to be the chairman of the National Climate Task Force, which oversees the 30 by 30 task force. And if you remember who this guy is, he was Obama's chief of staff, ran Hillary's campaign. He knows his way around Washington, D.C. One thing you may not know about him, though, is he is the founder of CAP, the Center for American Progress. And when he was appointed to this position, the articles that were coming out were really kind of interesting because they said, hey, he's going to hit the ground running because number one, he knows D.C., he knows how to get things going in Washington, D.C., and most of his employees from CAP are already established in the administration. All right, so how's this being implemented today? They're using existing laws that are already on the books to implement this agenda. Remember, this is an unauthorized agenda. There's no bill that has passed Congress that authorizes this. There's no constitutional authority for it. So they're taking existing laws, Endangered Species Act, the Federal Land Management Acts that govern the West, anything that they can use dealing with resources or species that they can then use the regulations differently to push everything towards this conservation protected agenda. They're funding federal land acquisitions. They have Congress permanently appropriated annually $900 million every year, half of which has to be spent on private land acquisitions. So where the government already owns nearly 40%, I don't get why Congress thinks they should be acquiring more. Encouraging enrollment in conservation programs. This has been the big carrot. The USDA, NRCS, you guys have all seen it. They have been coming out with a lot of programs, a lot of money. Land that used to not qualify for CRP land now qualifies. When I was here last time, Julie had just told me about, I hadn't even heard about this yet, where CRP was originally intended to be a 10-year program, and now they were changing it so you can now enroll for 30 years. So they keep stretching the time. They keep increasing how much land, how much money you're getting for the land. I was doing one of these talks in Colorado not too long ago, and it's in a grasslands prairie area. Well, they're doing CRP on the grasslands. And in this particular area, the one landowner told me that they grazed and that they could enroll in the grasslands CRP, not change one thing about their operation, continue to run all their cattle, everything that they were doing out there today, they could continue to do, and they would receive $100,000 a year for 10 years for doing nothing differently. And you know what? They turned it down. They passed up $1 million because they knew there is nothing free from the government. And they knew that there were strings attached, and that was just too good of a deal. And I'm going to tell you, they were right. They were right. But that is what the federal government is doing. That's what USDA is doing right now. I really look at them as the carrot. They have so much money that they are throwing at landowners. They're really putting landowners in a position now where you almost have to get into the federal programs and take those federal dollars to be competitive. Because the programs itself are out competing with the working landowner. They're raising the price of the land. They're making good workable land scarce. And then to be competitive with your neighbor and in the market, you need that extra cash flow to do so. The USDA programs are the carrot. And it's really at the Department of Interior where they have the stick. And one thing I don't know if I explained last year, I'm hoping I did, but I'm going to go ahead and explain it again. When you have the conservation programs on your land, it creates a federal nexus. So whenever there's any federal funding attached to your program or to your land, you are opening yourselves up to other federal regulations, other federal regulatory powers that may or may not impact you. Now, in previous administrations, nobody really worried about that. But in this administration, we really have to worry about that. The best example I can give you is the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act, when they list a species and create critical habitat, so let's say in this area, well, I'll use Kansas, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska right now, the lesser prairie chicken was just listed. And so they designate critical habitat over a huge, 5 states of land. Anybody who has a conservation program on their land now has a federal nexus to the Endangered Species Act that triggers the consultation provision. So the Endangered Species Act says that critical habitat does not apply to private land unless there's any federal funding program or approvals tied to your land. So now these conservation programs trigger the consultation process potentially between NRCS and Fish and Wildlife Service to see if maybe your land is habitat for a species that you don't know anything about. And also, they're acquiring all the data on your land. So one question that came from a Kansas commissioner just a couple weeks ago was, they're in the lesser prairie chicken area. It's been in CRP. They plan to pull it out. It comes out of enrollment this year, and they were going to put it back into crops. And the question they asked the attorney was, do we dare do that? If it's habitat now for the lesser prairie chicken, can we actually go use that land again once it comes out of CRP? And that's going to depend on if they have habitat on their land. So in other words, it just increases the problems that you may have and their ability to ramp down and use those restrictions when and if they want to. They're there. They're there. The other thing that they're doing is they're granting a ton of money to the environmental nonprofit, the NGOs, so the land trusts. Last year, the Department of Interior granted $1 billion to a nonprofit entity to implement 30 by 30. And right now, Congress is struggling with that now that we have a Republican Congress, and they're thinking, how do we get that money back? Because we never authorized that. That money is at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and they are granting that out to land trusts and others, state fish and wildlife agencies. They're granting it to a lot of people. But the land trust, here's what I find incredible. It's such a slush fund for them because they are getting paid. They make the grant to do this big ecosystem program in the Nebraska grasslands. And they come up with this big plan, and they make a grant for how much money they're going to need to get it in order to implement it. And so they get the grant, and then they go out and they convince landowners to put conservation easements on their property in these areas. They reap the benefit with our taxpayer money. They're not paying a thing. But here's the most frightening thing about that. What happens to that development right when a landowner signs the conservation easement with the land trust? What happens to that development right? That's an asset. That moves from the landowner's balance sheet to the nonprofits balance sheet. You ought to take a look at the Nature Conservancy's 990. They have to, when they file, that's their tax return. For all nonprofits, the tax return that they file, it's called a 990. You ought to Google that. Look up the Nature Conservancy 990. They have a balance sheet in there. Read through it. Find the line item of how much they hold in conservation easements. They are an extremely wealthy organization with large land holdings. They're not a conservation organization, they're a real estate company. And then if you really want to do a little digging, Google natural asset companies. In 2021, I believe, was the year, it might have been 2020, a group called Intrinsic Exchange Group created a new asset class on the New York Stock Exchange. They're called natural asset companies. And this is basically creating a company that allows people to invest in the air we breathe, clean water, easements, and a number of other natural assets. It's very interesting.
Where does their money come from?
They're investors. Go look it up.
Where does their money come from?
Go look it up.
I don't want to. You're talking to me about it. Come on. Where does their money come from?
Corporations. 43% from foundations, 25% from individuals, 20% from bequests, 10% from corporations, and 2% from trusts and others. That's where their money comes from.
All right. Okay. Another big one is wildlife corridors. Have you guys been hearing about this in your area yet? This will be on your radar. This is another big push, especially on the private lands, because it's a way to, if they come in and they say, this is the migration pattern for a certain species, we're going to need you to take down a few of your fences. Believe me, those fences are never going up. The wildlife corridors are really good to dissolve boundary lines, which then, of course, continues to erode the property right. These right now are really ramping up in the West on the federal lands. And in the West, they've come out with another great agenda. It's called Rewild in the American West. Do you guys remember ever hearing about the Wildlands Project? Okay, all right. 1992, the Biodiversity Treaty put forward this concept of rewilding America. And all of us, I know this sounds crazy, another one that you can look up, but they had all of us sitting, all the people in core areas with about 80% of America was planned to be completely rewild. We weren't using it. Well, this is kind of the new updated version of that for 2020. And it's called Rewild in the American West. And what they have planned in the West is creating 11 districts. They're colored on that map on the left. Those are the 11 districts. They're about 5,000 kilometers each. And they want to make those connected from Canada to Mexico to create wildlife corridors, primarily for the wolf, which takes up a lot of land, and the beaver, which takes the water. And they figure that those are two species that once you protect their habitat, you're protecting the habitat of many other species. So that's why they're targeting those two species. In these areas, there will be no grazing, no mining, no oil and gas, no recreation, no hunting, eventually. Eventually, they will get all that done. And to connect these areas where there's private land in between these federal lands areas, they will use conservation easements and the private land acquisitions, is what their plan says. If you've been hearing about Biden starting to create new national monuments, he just did one in Nevada a couple weeks ago. I fully expect these all to be monuments before he's left office. And are they acquiring private property? Absolutely. In Wyoming, June of last year, the BLM made the largest private land acquisition in the state of Wyoming that they have ever done, 35,000 acres. But what's really startling about this is that neither the county nor the governor knew it was happening until the press release came out. Do you remember last year, I think I told you guys that one of the first things they did at the Department of Interior after 30 by 30 was initiated, 13 days after it was initiated, they got rid of a secretarial executive order, Department of Interior, which said before they made any private land acquisitions, they had to get the consent of the county and the governor. Do you remember me telling you about that one? When they got rid of that one, that cleared the way for something like this to happen. This can be going on in your state right now and you wouldn't know it. And the conservation programs. I've talked a little bit already about the dangers of the conservation programs. And I think what's really what's sad about all that is that the intent of the conservation programs was really good when they were first initiated in the Food Safety Act of 1985. I mean, the intent was to help landowners do more with their land. Good soil and water conservation projects, good improvements, the things that increased agriculture production. But they've turned into something else. And we knew this was coming because there's a report that was published, the House Select Report on the climate crisis, in which they laid out all the plans that they would need all the policies they would need to put in place in order to implement 30 by 30. And one of those was that they needed to change the conservation program language. So the language for the CRP program, for EQIP, for the agriculture conservation easements, for the wetland reserve easements, those all needed to change so that the focus of those was not on agriculture production, but was on mitigating climate change. So that was in that House Select report. Well, August of 2022, just last year, when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, they allocated $20 billion more to those conservation programs. And with that, they changed the language. Right now, they're starting to enroll people in this new brand of money. Be very, very careful if you're considering signing up for it. This is what the EQIP program says now under this money. It says that the money is to prioritize proposals that utilize diet and feed management to reduce enteric methane emissions from ruminants. They're very worried about livestock gas and belches. So now if you're taking money from this EQIP program, allocated from the Inflation Reduction Act, you're now committing to help control livestock gas. To directly improve soil carbon or reduce nitrogen losses or greenhouse gas emissions. What is carbon dioxide? It's plant food. But now they want you controlling it. Sequester greenhouse gases emissions associated with agriculture production. So this is you. You guys are the offenders now. The Secretary shall prioritize projects and activities that mitigate or address climate change through the management of agriculture production by reducing or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. Now they're focused on managing agriculture production. This is no longer our food security being independently controlled by the market through private landowners. This is the federal government controlling the food production in America. That's where this is headed. So right now, NRCS is making all their announcements. I get not all the releases, but enough of their releases, that they're, allocating a bunch of new money under the Inflation Reduction Act for climate-smart projects. Be very careful. If you guys are signing up for any of these programs, don't think that they're the programs you're used to. Read the language. Require them to give you the full contracts. All right, let's back out. We know this is an international agenda, and this has been had a foothold in other nations for some time now, including the European Union. So if you guys have been watching the headlines and reading about what's going on in the Netherlands, what they are doing is they are just a little bit further ahead with their 30 by 30 program than we are. So the European Union signed up under Natura 2000. Natura 2000 is their version of 30 by 30. And if you go to the Natura 2000 website, you'll read some very familiar language. This is just about helping the working landowner. We are going to conserve and restore the lands. We respect property rights. All of that is on their website, just like it is on the 30 by 30 website. All of the White House documents, the America the Beautiful stuff at Department of Interior. It's all there. It's the same language. But what has happened? So over the years, they keep putting in more and more restrictions. They get landowners to voluntarily sign up for different programs, and then they come back in, and now they're going to have to protect this little moss that's here that grows nowhere else, and some other forbs. And then they've decided that the Netherlands produces too much nitrogen dioxide. Did I say that right? Nitrogen dioxide, which is animal feces. So they need the farmers and the ranchers to reduce the animal feces. Now, some people think it's because there's too much nitrogen dioxide going into the environment, and that's why they want to control it. That's actually not what it is. It's because under this system, the Netherlands only gets so many nitrogen dioxide credits. Right now, agriculture is using most of those. And they want to put in wind farms and solar farms, the renewables, which also produce the nitrogen dioxides. So they need those permits, those permitted numbers, to do the renewables so that they can appear to be sustainable. That's why they have to cut the landowners. So what they've done is the Dutch government's Nature and Nitrogen Minister issued a rule last year that said she was requiring that 2,000 to 3,000 landowners voluntarily sell their land to the government. Only in a socialist nation do you force somebody to voluntarily sell anything. 2,000 to 3,000 farmers and ranchers are supposed to do that. And in that report, she says, if this doesn't happen, she doesn't have enough volunteers by August, it is with pain in our hearts that we will have to enter into a discussion with a targeted group in which mandatory instruments will be used if necessary. They're going to go take their land. That's exactly what's happening. And they can do it under Natura 2000. This is the precursor to 30 by 30 in America. Don't think this can't happen on our soil. We're walking down this path right now. All right. The next thing that happened at the end of last year is the international body, the United Nations, finally was successful in putting together a 30 by 30 agreement that over 100 nations signed. And let me walk you through a few key things. It does all the 30 by 30 stuff that we've been talking about, although it adds one critical element to this. Remember, it's land and oceans. The Nature Conservancy in the pre-negotiations, I read a few of their articles that they put out. They were very disappointed in the negotiations that they hadn't yet been able to get them to include inland waters as well. Well, they succeeded. This one that signed, they got the inland waters in there. The Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund were the two entities really pushing for that. But here's some other interesting things that this document does. There's only one religion mentioned in this document, and it's worshiping Mother Earth. I think last time when I was here, I told you what we're fighting is we're fighting a group of people who don't believe in a higher power. They don't worship the Creator, they worship the creation. Mother Earth is their God. And we're seeing that right here in this international document. They also say nature should have equal rights with humans. And of course, there's no time to think about this. We've lost time. We don't have any time to think about this. We just need to act. We need transformative action. You need to turn over your property to them now. And they succeeded in getting the nations to commit to $200 billion to implement this. You know what I think is really the part of this that really troubles me the most is right now in America, they're still having a problem getting this done. There's resistance here. They're not having as easy of time here as they thought they were going to have to get this done. But there are a lot of third world countries out there. The people don't have the rights that we have, and they're not able to fight this. And their governments are buying into this. And there are organizations fighting this that represent the poor people that are losing their land to this agenda. And America is in on the caper. Our government is helping to make that happen. Now, I will tell you, one very good thing about this document is the United States did not sign it. Now, that might really surprise you because they certainly helped negotiate it, and they certainly helped get it passed. But there's a reason they couldn't sign it. Remember that 1992 Biodiversity Treaty that I mentioned earlier that had the Wildlands Project? That's when the Wildland Project came out. That was sitting in the Senate, ready for a floor vote to be approved by the Senate. Senate has to approve all treaties. When Kay Bailey Hutchinson from Texas walked down the aisle with the Wildlands Project maps and said, this is what this is going to do. And she uncovered, and actually it wasn't her, but it was a couple of our patriots, and you guys would have met Craig Rucker. You remember Craig Rucker? Mm-hmm. All right, Craig was one of the two people. Craig Rucker and Henry Lamb were the two people who uncovered those maps, got into the right senator's hands, that exposed all this right before the Senate vote. So the Senate never ratified the Biodiversity Treaty. And this agreement was an amendment to that treaty, so the United States couldn't sign it. Now, I think that's a really cool story because that's people just like you sitting in this room who took on that cause and beat it in 1992, and it has saved us in 2022, 30 years later. Now, that's a cool story. That's a very cool story. All right. So when 30 by 30 was initiated, you guys know what we did. We started getting the resolutions to oppose 30 by 30 across the nation. We still have a lot of these coming on board. Right now, there's several coming out of Oklahoma. So people all across the nation are still passing these, which is really important. One of the things that we have to be looking towards right now is we are coming up on another presidential election. It really is closer than we think. And this is the moment right now where we need to make 30 by 30 that kind of an issue that no president, no candidate running for president is going to agree with this agenda. We all know we have a lot of green Republicans. And the ones that I'm afraid of are the ones that say, yeah, we really don't agree with the 30%, but 20%'s okay. Those are the ones that kill us. So we have to continue to make 30 by 30 one of those issues that anybody who gets elected in this nation wants to be fully opposed to. And we do that through the grassroots. That's why the resolutions are so important. We have to continue to show that we are fighting this agenda. And I got to tell you, I actually have a really good, very current story because it just happened today. But we gave one of these talks in Georgetown, where we live, last Thursday. And one of the ladies who was there, she's up at our Texas Capitol. We meet every 2 years. Our legislature does every 2 years, and they're still in session. And so that next Friday, she emails me and then called me and said, hey, I think a bill has been filed in the Texas House that's dealing exactly with what you're talking about to implement 30 by 30. And Dan and my husband Dan and I went, what? So we look at the bill, and it absolutely was. It was creating a land and wildlife fund in the state of Texas. So Texas Parks and Wildlife and Texas CEQ and all of these agencies could take the federal funds to increase our parks and, of course, give grants to the nonprofits to create the land trusts. It was to implement 30 by 30. It was exactly the package that they needed in place. And so just last night, about 9 o'clock, we sent out an alert on this to our Texas group. So we have the list, Liberty Matters, that we produce, and I'm hoping most of you are signed up, and if you aren't, please sign up, because this is exactly how we utilize this list. So we took all of our Texas members, sent them an alert that this bill was going through, was going to be heard tomorrow in committee. And we got a lot of calls rolling. My husband's there, he's working the issue. By the time I got to Sioux City, I had an email message saying that the senator had pulled the bill, who had filed the bill. She pulled it. Yeah. And the senator was one of the members that's really surprised us that she would have ever filed this, because she's been really good for us on a lot of issues. You know, we always looked at her as very property rights friendly, but I don't think she had any idea what this particular bill was doing. Exactly. So I don't think there was anything disingenuous about what she did. I think she was uninformed. But this is where you guys come into, why you guys are so important in this battle. I mean, don't think that you're just here tonight listening to a talk. I can tell you there are a lot of people in Texas just like you that heard me give this talk thinking, man, that's terrible, but I don't know what I'm going to do about it. Well, they got our alert last night, and let me tell you, they did something about it that was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, my husband was sitting there saying, they are burning up the phone lines. We don't think this is going to come out of committee in the House. At least we hope that's what the outcome is. But my point is, this is not that we called, that Dan and I are not necessarily, we're not lobbyists. So we didn't call up, key members of the House and say, hey, you got to pull this bill. We went to you guys. We told you guys that this bill is running, and you guys know what to do. You called your members, or I should say in Texas, that's exactly what happened. So all of this stuff that I'm going through with you tonight, there is going to be a moment where you guys are going to have to take action. And you're going to need to educate not your representative, because she's already with us, but you're going to need to take action. And of course, you know how the Biden administration responded once this agenda was really exposed. They changed it. So now it's called America the Beautiful, and they do their annual reports every year. I've started to go through the 2022 annual America the Beautiful report. It's really fun. But they still are using this agenda, and they're still trying to really fool the American people as to what this agenda is. They still do a lot of polling. They come out with polls all the time about how 70% of Americans really want to conserve 30% of our lands. Well, when you say it like that, that would include all of us who own private property. We just don't think that the government should be controlling that. We think private landowners should. All right, so what you can do to help stop 30 by 30. Research the organizations you support. You will be surprised how many organizations you support, recreation organizations, other organizations that actually support 30 by 30. Research them. If they are supporting 30 by 30, stop giving money to them. Educate your elected officials. You have to educate. You have to continue to educate. Even when you think you have one informed on this and they think they know what it's about, keep educating them. Don't let them forget about this issue. And you've got to pass the local resolution. This is going to be key. It's going to be key coming into the presidential election. And of course, make sure you're signed up for our materials, and we will do our best to keep you educated on this. And we do state alerts. So we have other states that'll call and say, this is going on in our issue. Can you get out an alert on this for us to help stop this agenda? And we do that on a state-by-state basis. But I had people call from in Texas saying, how come I didn't get the alert? I'm here in Texas. Well, they didn't have Texas in there. They just put in their email address and not their state. So when you sign up, make sure you put your state so we can do those state selects. So one of the other things that we've started to do is we have, with the House changing in DC, we have some really good opportunities. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, our Texas Agriculture Commissioner, we met with him, and he asked if we would come in and meet with the Western Caucus. The Western Caucus from DC, so all the Western members, were in Fort Worth, and he was hosting them. So we asked if we'd come in and explain the conservation programs, a lot like what I just did here with you guys, to those members. And it was actually aired on RFD TV, the Cowboy Channel. And I was on a panel interviewed by Representative Fishbaugh from Minnesota. And we got into these issues, and she asked some really good questions. But one of the things we told her is that what we're very concerned about is this new conservation language that they put in the Inflation Reduction Act, they're planning to put in the Farm Bill. And that's in their agenda. I've seen news reports where they've come out and the environmentalists have said, now we need to push for this language to be the permanent language from here forever in the Farm Bill. So fortunately, when the Western Caucus was there, we did the presentation, and it was before 12 of our representatives and about 40 staff people. And the chairman of the Agriculture Committee in the House, G.T. Thompson, was there. And he came down afterwards and he committed, he said, this climate crisis stuff is not going in the Farm Bill. So that was really, really good. Yeah. And he also told our Texas Ag Commissioner that this stuff was not going in the Farm Bill. But that's another really key thing that you guys can do here today, is make sure your representatives and your senators know that this conservation language, that change I showed you, and you should have a briefing paper on it as well, which is the briefing paper that we have shared with Congress. And it goes through and it shows side by side the difference in the language, and then it has the policy suggestions at the end on things that they can do. There's some very key things that they can do in the Farm Bill. Number one, go back to the original language. We don't use the climate crisis language for the future programs. Number two, conservation easements in perpetuity. There are 2 programs that are approved: the Agricultural Easement Program and the Wetlands Reserve Program, which is the one that has given the people in North Dakota so many problems. Those two conservation easement programs should have a sunset clause. Limit them to 30 years or less. Get rid of the in perpetuity. Land should be managed by the living. It's not our place to tell future generations what they can and can't do with the land. We make our decisions while we're here. They get to make theirs while they are there. So term it. 30 years or less allows the next generation, allows you to do what you want to do with your land. And then it allows the next generation to decide if they want to continue with that program or get out of the conservation easement. So term it. That is also a really good policy position, because what you'll find is you will find out very quickly who are in these programs for good conservation reasons and who are in them for control. Because the people who disagree with terming conservation easements are those that want to control that land forever. That's a really good thing that can be done. The other thing that we've asked is that they make an exclusion. They exclude the conservation programs, the CRP, the EQIP, all of these that I've been talking about, from that endangered species provision, the consultation provision, so that the federal nexus does not attach to the private lands. They can do that. They can do that. And let me tell you, if they did that, it wouldn't just be stopping 30 by 30, it would be rolling it back. You do that, you term the conservation easements, and you have set the environmental movement back. We're not just talking about stopping it now. Those are ideas that we shared with those 12 members, and they really seem to really embrace them. So now where we need your help is for you to educate your own members on this. That's why you have the briefing paper. And educate your associations. I think sometimes the agriculture organizations get so focused on creating the safety net for the next season or the next farm bill that sometimes they forget about some of the other linkages that can be in there. So you need to educate your associations too. If this comes from the ground up, we can get this done. It won't happen if it's the top down because we don't have that kind of power. But if it comes from the ground up, we can get this done. So those are some very key things. The other thing I would love to see done in the Farm Bill is to get rid of the programs that grant money to the NGOs. All it is a slush fund. It's taking money out of the pockets of the producer and the taxpayer for no benefit for us. So if we could find a way to cut that grant funding to the NGOs, that would be fantastic as well. So those are some 3 pretty good ideas that you guys can help advocate through your members on the Farm Bill in particular. And then we're working on a whole bunch of other things that I probably shouldn't share with you quite yet. But that's the big one right now, the one that you guys could really help us get moving. Also, I should tell you that we have set another Stop 30 by 30 Summit. You're the first place that we're actually publicly announcing it. I haven't put anything in writing yet. But we are going to do it in Dallas, Texas this year. And it'll be September 21st through the 23rd.
I dare you to do it in Dallas, South Dakota.
Well,
A lot more to go.
so we thought about just kind of going back to Nebraska again, like we did last year, which was a lot of fun. And we have so much support there, but we thought, we really need to spread this around. And so Texas just became a really good fit. And now that we're having this fight in our own state right now, like this, it's even shown me even more how we need to bring this in to Texas. So, but our plan is to rotate this around the country, the summit around the country. And I'll be in DC in a couple weeks, and I'll be extending invitations to some of the key members that we want to come out and visit. And instead of the one-day session, which we crammed so much in that day, I don't know if you guys were tired, but I was tired. It was a lot in a short amount of time. So that's why we're expanding it to the 2 days. And it's going to be a fantastic program. So I hope you guys will all think about coming. The reason we picked that week is it tends to be a good week for agriculture, September 21st through the 23rd, but also because it was the Sunday before that our Congress adopted the Constitution. It's Constitution Day. And the Sunday after is when they adopted the Bill of Rights. So it's a really, really good time for us to gather together and remember why we're Americans. Thank you.